So welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be here. I cannot wait to chat about all the things together.
Yeah, me neither. Okay. So for those who are just getting to know you, so what can you share a little bit about your story and what shaped your faith and identity early on?
Early on, I would say my faith and my identity was shaped like when we're talking about like in my early childhood years, like growing up. Is that what you're thinking? Or okay. Definitely shaped by my family. My parents divorced when I was 4. And I grew up in a very Mormon family. I'm a very Mormon, very LDS family dynamic. And my parents had a very, very contentious relationship. And that really formed my identity about who I was because my mom and my dad both were so hurt and so I utilizing all the tools that they had. Really, I don't think that either one of them were ever trying to do anything harmful. They were both hurting deeply. And it just came out in everything that they did. And they were doing what they knew. And, but in that process, I questioned everything about who I was because everything they said about the other, I internalized about myself because I knew I was both of them. And
Sure.
so that really deeply shaped who I was. And without even them intentionally doing that, shaped me to this belief in myself that I was bad.
Mhm.
And I really grew up with this very deep-seated belief that something was wrong with me because both of my parents were so hurt and so convicted about how terrible the other person was. I knew I was half of each of them. And I was hearing from both sides constantly through my childhood years about how they've done X, Y, or Z wrong, or how they handled X, Y, or Z wrong, or how it was doing X, Y, or Z to us. And so I just carried this belief that I somehow was bad and that that's who I really was. I carried this. I'm the fourth of 5 between of my mom and my dad's marriage. My older siblings were really, my older sister specifically was like our little caretaker and protector. And, it's interesting to see now that I've studied so much about dynamics and personalities, how each of the like hierarchy in the family order, the sibling order. My mom ended up remarrying and having 2 more, and I ended up the middle child and classic middle child kind of
Yeah.
syndrome. But how, yes, classic middle child syndrome. But I grew up watching my older sisters and my older brother performing, and they were very talented. They were very athletic. They were very smart. They were very gregarious, and they were very outgoing. And I'm very friendly, but I'm more quiet and soft in comparison skill wise. And so I grew up truly believing I had no talents, that I didn't have anything to offer, and that I didn't have anything special about me. I watched it. My one sister is very musically inclined. They're both athletic. And I was like, I can't tune, I can't sing, I can't play an instrument. I do everything kind of mediocre. Again, this middle child, like I'm just mediocre in every way.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was like almost 40. I really was almost 40 before I ever really believed I actually had anything to contribute or a value that anybody would want to hear about or know about, or that I could even help in any way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that really was kind of the basis of who I am. And then it was all shaped around these Mormon beliefs and identity. And my faith was everything. And I thought if I just believe and if I just live all these things that I'm supposed to believe in, that somehow in some way God will make up for all of it. And I will just magically become somebody special someday.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that your faith kind of was your entire identity, right? So how does that show up in a way that you live
Mhm.
your life day
Yeah.
to day?
Well, oh, you cut out for just a second. How does it show up away? How?
How does it show up in the way that you show your day to day life?
Now I understand none of those things are true.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been able to. I've been, yeah. So that was one of the things that was really important to me. Again, always following God and knowing who he was and being close to him. And after I went through my divorce and my whole faith transformation, one of the major things that God showed me was how all of these things I believed about myself and my identity were not who he ever said I was.
Yeah.
And so learning who he said I was and what he had for me and what the role he plays in my life and who he truly is, learning who he truly is made who I truly am so much more clear.
Yeah.
And that completely shifted everything about myself, who I believe that I am, how I show up in the world, how I show up for my children, how I show up for myself, and how I show up for him, truly.
So we've been talking for several weeks about purity culture. And so how did purity culture come into play in
Mhm.
those early years and then right into your marriage and then up to the time when you were 40, you could able to kind of, ascertain who you were exact more purely.
Yeah, so because of my upbringing, I will say I did not learn and understand, even though there is this purity culture, even in Mormonism, there's still very, one of, they call these like values for women and young women as you're growing up is virtue. And the modesty and integrity and your morality and is a huge message in that culture as well. um, and I unfortunately grew up just because of, where my own parents were in their own journey. Again, I don't think it was their fault, and they never intentionally put me ever in compromising situations,
Yep.
but they did. And I ended up being abused most of my childhood, and mistreated. And again, part of that identity that I learned to accept was that my value was in um, the desirability I had for men,
Mm.
for if that makes sense, for me to be seen as an object. I learned to be objectification was love, is what I learned, unfortunately.
Yeah,
And
I
again,
think
it's
that's
not
huge in
any of my
purity
parents'
culture.
fault. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
huge in purity
Yes.
culture. That thing that, women are, it's
Yeah.
rape, it's because the woman wasn't dressed appropriately. Or if there's any kind of abuse, it's because
Yeah.
the women asked for it. Or, like it's that whole
Yeah.
objectifying that happens. So I totally can relate to that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So I really learned that that was love. And what's interesting as I've kind of understood more about attachment styles and theories. Your attachment styles are formed in your early childhood years based on the way that you are loved. So whether you are comforted, whether your feelings are validated, whether you're just held, or how your parents interact with you is what your nervous system learns as love. And unfortunately, I didn't learn that again until like recent years, but I realized that my nervous system had learned that physical attraction and desirability from men was love. And that is what felt safe to my nervous system. And so that shaped a lot of my experiences with men and relationships, all throughout the years. And I would say one of the things when I met my ex-husband, he didn't have that same perspective, so to speak. And it was the one thing that really attracted me to him was he was attracted to me as me, is what it felt like in different ways. It wasn't, he was like a physical desire for me. And so I knew that physically I was safe and protected. And that was what all I thought was necessary. So unfortunately, that's not all that's necessary.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So what do you think about so when you think about women navigating faith, doubt, and identity, so what are you seeing right now?
Loneliness over and over and over again. Women are terrified of feeling lonely. And that comes from two different ends, actually. So there are women who are what we would call like an anxious attachment style, where she's actively seeking validation for love and attention and affection. And the presence, the physical presence is what her nervous system identifies as safe. And she just wants to be chosen. And because she doesn't want to be alone. And then there's another type, I call her the chaser. And then there's another type on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is an avoider. So an avoidant style of attachment has learned that deep emotional connection is not safe. And it triggers your nervous system into this fight or flight mode, where the nervous system of the chaser is triggered when someone walks away. The cutoff's nervous system is triggered when someone gets close. And so, but at the root, both of them are avoiding loneliness. The closeness for the cutoff is what feels not safe, because she thinks she's chosen and then they have stepped away. So being vulnerable feels unsafe, and allowing someone in feels unsafe, but she's still craving the connection and still trying to avoid loneliness by saying, I am choosing to keep all of that away. So instead of not allowing someone to choose her, she's proactively saying, I'm not choosing. So she pushes away and puts up a barrier, where the other cutoff is saying, I can't be alone. So I need you to choose me and validate me in order for me not to be alone, where the other, if that makes sense. So there are two opposite sides of the spectrum, but the core wound is still, I don't want to be alone.
Yeah. I think that as women are listening to this, they're like, okay, am I a avoider? Where, yeah, am I a chaser? Where do I fall in there? Am I healthy? Where do I fall in the spectrum? So I think that is so good. So can you walk us through this season where everything shifted at once? Your marriage, your faith, your identity, and then what was that really like in real life?
Yeah, this was an intense season for me, but that's just kind of how I roll. I'm this kind of go big or go home personality, so it seems like everything always happens at once. But I went through my separation. So after 17 years, I was married for 17 years. I have 5 children, and I went through my separation. As soon as I went through my separation, I kind of was, well, right at this whole entire process of me separating, I was really kind of right now, I understand that I was really groomed by this man who was, I now understand, was a very aggressive narcissist behavior tendencies. And so, but he encouraged me to read the Bible. So I started reading the Bible, found out that what I'd been believing my entire life wasn't actually true. So I went through my separation. I realized that my whole entire religion and foundation for my faith that has shaped my identity and who I am is actually not true. I went through a transition of completely being separated from every person and community. And then my children, I went from full-time mom of 5 kids, like I didn't even go to the bathroom by myself, to I had a whole entire week by myself. I moved out, and again, so all in like 2.5 months. So it was a really intense period of time, but I will say God really held me, and I was always looking and chasing after a deep relationship with God, and I knew something had been missing in my life. And so when I finally was alone, I had to be alone. He just said, now that I have your attention. And I was like, oh, I just needed to like stop and be still and be quiet.
Yeah. Amazing what happens in those silent.
So even yes, exactly. And so I came to, even though it was a very uncomfortable process and it was a very difficult time to be alone, like I literally hadn't been alone in 17 years. And really through most of my childhood, because I'm the fourth of 5 children. Like I was never ever alone. And so really for the first time in my whole entire life, I was alone. And God really, really held me. And what I came to find and understand is that He really is the only one who can see me fully, who can choose me fully, who does choose me fully, and who is fully present and accepts me fully exactly the way I am. And that he walked me through this kind of period of understanding again who he is, then therefore who I am as his, what his word actually says about what it means to have and be in an intimate relationship with him first. And that I really couldn't give my children any example of a worldly love without first giving them his love. And I couldn't give them his love without understanding it myself. And so while that season was very difficult in many, many ways, it really laid this beautiful foundation for me in paving the paths forward in those and still today to this day, even when I will say I'm still not used to the silence, I'm still not used to the quiet, but I have learned to make peace with it. And I have come to appreciate the time that I am allowed to just be with my creator.
I love that. So, how did you show up for your kids during this time? So, you have like this spaces of silence that you could just talked about, and the time that it really brought God in your life and helping you become more comfortable with the silence and know right, acknowledging that is a huge growth period for you in your identity. But how did you show up for your kids when they were grieving and rebuilding at the same time?
I will say it's been different for each of my kids. So my girls, my oldest was 16 at the time, my youngest was 3. So they're at very different stages and they still are at very different stages. But because I had been through this experience, so my parents were 4, so I was really my whole entire childhood, that's all I knew. I was really determined to not create that same dynamic. What I have come to realize is was giving them that contention of what I was trying to avoid giving my children from what I had in my childhood.
Yeah.
I was giving that to them in my marriage dynamic. And that was a really difficult realization. And what I came to learn was that children thrive when there's harmony between the parents, whether that marriage is intact or whether it's in 2 separate homes. And so navigating that process with my children and allowing them to be wherever they're at is what God has given me to be able to hold each of them. And I will say it's very difficult because we're not on the same page. My ex-husband and I are not on the same page or ideas or beliefs about any of those things, how it looks. We have very different perspectives about it. We manage it in very different ways.
Yeah.
And the separation has just highlighted, the huge dichotomy between our 2 personalities and who we are. And in some senses exacerbated that conflict. And in some ways, it's been able to subside because now we're at least in separate homes and we can create the environments that we want to. But then our kids are living in these 2 very different environments.
Yeah.
And so that has been difficult. That has been very difficult, especially for my younger children, especially because I've left Mormonism and he is still very active there. My 3 oldest are girls, my 2 youngest are boys. And my 3 oldest girls were very excited that when I told them we were not going back to church anymore. But my boys don't know, you know.
Yeah.
My girls were very excited about that, but I said, but we're not giving up on God. But for my boys, it's been very difficult to manage. And again, it's God, I have to continue to pray and ask for guidance of that and just how to remove what I just let go of the rope. How do I not engage in conflict with my ex? And how do I instead create as much harmony and collaboration and respect for where he is at and what he is doing? Not because I want it in return, but because I know for my children, the best thing I can give them is a mutually respectful relationship with their father. And whether or not he returns that or not, or whether he chooses to engage, I can choose to engage and I can choose to do what I absolutely can to let go of the rope and to get out of God's way, because I'm not going to change him or that dynamic on my own. God really has to help shape that. So I do my best to really surrender to whatever God has for my kids And I will say is, one day I was very concerned about this. It was newly in my separation. I was very concerned about my kids learning and understanding that Mormonism isn't actually what the Bible is teaching. And I was praying to God about how he should save them, how he needs to take care of them, how he needs to X, Y, or Z. And he just very firmly, but very lovingly said to me, they are mine before they are yours.
Yeah. Yep.
And I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So,
you shared
so
before. So you shared it before that
Mhm.
your their father is a narcissist, right? That's a big word, buzzword, spread
Oh,
all over the place. So can you share a little bit about A, what the characteristics of that are, and B, how does that as a man in your boys' life, how does that affect them and who they think they want me to be as they grow up into young men?
yeah. Yeah. So their dad exhibits um characteristics of what's called like a covert narcissist. He hasn't been like clinically diagnosed with that or anything like that. It's just he's just doing what he has learned how to do, quite honestly, from his parents. A really aggressive kind of narcissist relationship I had was with a man that entered my life after that separation. Um, but so their dad, I mean, I can't really label him like as a, you know, narcissist, but he has those tendencies. But I think we all do in many ways. And that was a huge concern for me in my marriage watching my boys. Like I had, as soon as I had boys, I'm like, I'm giving them a model that I cannot change anymore of who to follow after and who's going to teach them and train them what it means to be a man. And that was very concerning for me. And it was very concerning for me with my girls because I knew I had my own father wounds, not because my dad is perfect, or I mean, none of us are perfect, right?
Right.
But just because of my experience with my dad, and I didn't want to give my girls those same father wounds. But in reality, I had already chosen and they already had it. And I can't change those things. And that is the biggest guilt, the biggest weight that I carry, honestly, is that, and what I try to tell everyone is like, before you enter into a marriage, like this is, you've got to understand the realities of the partner, but the father figure you are going to provide for your children. And I didn't know that. I didn't know how to choose that. And again, that's the biggest weight that I carry, is that this is the father I have chosen for them. And in many ways, he is an amazing dad. In many ways, he loves them very deeply. He truly does. And in many ways, and that was a thing for me, was like, I'm not going to take my children from their dad. I won't give them that. Like, I only get to have one parent and their perspective, which is what I had
Yeah.
growing up. And I didn't want to do that to my children. And I think that is kind of what God has showed me, is that they are his before they're mine. And that if it was supposed to be different, it would be different. And he has a plan for them that he has prepared for them, just like he did for me,
Yeah.
just like he has for me. And that he knows them intimately, just as he does me. And he has them just as he has me. And so when I focus on what I think it should or shouldn't be, then God reminds me that all this experiences, he's got it all. And everything that they're going through is to help them truly in their benefit in the long run. And his timeline is not my own. His ways are not my own. And I'm not going to understand, but I can do what I think he wants me to do,
Yeah.
which is to give them him. And that's what I continue to go back towards, is that while I cannot change who they already have here, what can I do? Which is, I can learn about God and build my relationship and understand that, and then pass that along. My oldest son one time said, why do we have to learn about the Bible? Why do we have to do this? It feels like we're having to choose. And I said, because I didn't know there was a choice.
Yeah.
And I know that this is really difficult, but I just want you to know there's a choice. There are options. this actually isn't the only option, and this isn't the only truth. In fact, it's not the whole truth at all.
Right.
And it isn't about choosing a parent. This isn't about choosing a religion. This is about building a relationship with your creator. And you can't do that if you don't know who he is. So my job is just to try to help you understand who he is so you can understand who you are and you can truly build that from there. And that's, I have to surrender all the rest to the Lord, which is not easy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it teaches good critical thinking skills too, right? I think that, too often if you are in a home where it's like, this is what we do, this is what you learn, this is what, like, kids when they get to be,
Mhm. Mhm.
adults go, but now I have all these other options. I have all these other things that and like, I don't even know who I am.
Mhm.
And I'm swimming in, amongst all the,
Mhm.
ideas and things that are coming at me as an adult, right? The other thing that I think is
Mhm.
really good is that
Yep.
whole
Yeah.
piece, because there are so many chemicals that happen in your body when you're attracted to somebody and you are just like, oh my
So
gosh, who's
true.
that? Right? But you're so right. There's such a ripple effect, right? Like you plunk a stone in the water and it just like ripples out. The same thing, right? You are choosing, when you choose to marry somebody, you are choosing not only those happy feelings that are going to last a brief time in the first part of your marriage, but you're choosing the father for your children. You're
Right.
choosing the partner that you're going to have after they grow
Mhm.
up. You're choosing like a whole multitude of different pieces. So important.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and their character is their character, their tendencies, their habits, their behaviors are going to be passed on to your children and your posterity and the dynamic you have. It's just there's so many things that I've learned about it that now I'm like, okay, I just want to teach my children to understand these dynamics here. And really my goal is, and my motto, what I say is my mission is really about rebuilding biblical communities by rebuilding biblical homes, one woman at a time. Just because we're saved doesn't mean we're healed, but just because we've been through really traumatic things doesn't mean we have to perpetuate that cycle. And so I just want women to understand, like, you don't have to continue this and perpetuate this onto your children, and your children don't have to carry this and they don't have to repeat it. And the ability to have healthy, loving, biblical, godly relationships is possible, but you have to understand what it really requires and then do the work to create those.
I love that. Okay, so what do you say to the woman who's listening today who believes that as they made that marriage commitment, they made a covenant with God, and it doesn't matter how he treats her or what is happening in their home, like that has to come first. I can't leave because we now have this covenant with God, and I feel trapped. So, what do you say to that mom who's listening right now?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's how I felt for 17 years. And that's why I stayed.
Yep, yep.
I understand. I really do. And that's why I stayed. I will say I knew pretty much immediately. I mean, we had an autograph frame for our wedding reception, and we got married in 8 weeks. So from the day that we met, the day we got married, it was 8 weeks.
Yep.
And very fast, even by Mormon culture standards. So, but my aunt, who's not Mormon and is one of the very like sound voices in my life, had wrote on our little frame, keep talking, talking, talking. And I read that on the night of, we went home after the reception and everything, and we're opening gifts. And I read that and I was like, I don't know how to talk to this person. We
Oh.
don't know how to talk to each other. We don't, yeah. And I was like, I think it's going to be okay though. It wasn't.
Nope.
Because that's the foundation for so many things. And I will say, I do not encourage divorce. And part of my reason why I stayed was because I never wanted to give my children the experience that I had. And I was determined that I was going to make this work. But what the faulty was not that he was the wrong man or that anything was wrong with him or wrong with me, was that I had the wrong perspective and understanding of what that covenant meant and why I had chose him. And that foundation was very weak. And I did not understand how I actually just can perpetuated all those things from my childhood into my marriage. And I brought them in. to my marriage. And I created that same dynamic in my marriage. And again, I do not promote divorce at all. I used to say, you know, you got to make it work, you've got to figure it out. And I just think you just got to muscle through. Everyone deals with something. I just have to deal with this and I have to make the very best of it. But Jesus does allow for instances for divorce for a reason, because he hates divorce because of the consequences and the pain and suffering it causes,
Yeah.
but he also hates the pain and suffering of our sin wherever we're at.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sometimes in a marriage dynamic or any relationship dynamic, we have unbiblical foundations and we have unbiblical relationships, and we are perpetuating cycles of toxic relationship patterns without even knowing that's what we're doing. And that also is not God's design. That is also outside his parameters for godly relationships. And I'm not saying you can't repair those. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to repair those. But there are instances when you truly can't. And you know, everyone says, you know, what God brought together, no man shall bring apart. But sometimes we bring things together. He did not. And what I came to understand was that just because I had chosen this and I had walked through the door does not mean that's what he brought to me. And it doesn't mean that it was his plan. And again, it's never his plan for us to be mistreated or abused or be abusive. That is not his plan. And you cannot make anybody else join that without God's help. And if God is telling you, sometimes he does tell you that this is not his design and it is the best thing for you to do, separate that, unfortunately. And sometimes, as again, as much as we hate to say, and again, I don't promote or encourage this, and I think you should do everything you can, but there are some people with personality disorders you truly cannot resolve with. And that's why taking the time to build the foundation first before you enter into that covenant is so important. But when you've never had that modeled, you don't know how to do that and you don't know what it looks like. But condemning people for having been in that way and telling them that they have to now stay there is also not his plan. So it's a very delicate thing. And I absolutely say you should seek all the help and advice that you possibly can get from truly biblical support where you're fully seen and heard. And unfortunately, I talk to so many women who are getting this message that you just have to stay, you just have to make it work, you just have to stay. And there is, unfortunately, in that dynamic, we are supporting the perpetrator instead of the victim. And so I just think if you have a ministry or if you are a pastor, you're any kind of leadership, it's really important that you get the training on how to understand these dynamics and do everything you can not to continue to encourage the abuse and to not to encourage the perpetrator and not to vindicate, unfortunately, that perpetrator, because that's also not God's plan. God doesn't say we should stay in a situation where we're being mistreated. So it's very prayerful, you know, decisions, and it's truly up to you and God. And nobody else can ever fully know every aspect of what's going on. But so I just want you to know there's hope and there's healing and there are solutions, and God's plan for you is yours. He treated every individual as an individual. He didn't ever say, you all have to follow this. In fact, he tells us over and over and over again, whenever you get tied and stuck to the law, then we are bound by the law. And we're never going to be redeemed by the law. We're redeemed by him. So we have to look to him for guidance and support, not to cultural norms or community standards or even to the law, because at the end of the day, God is the law. We have to follow him. So just stay focused on him and what he has for you and follow where he has. He's not going to lead you astray. Don't get so focused on the list, the checklist. That's temporary because that's not always the answer.
True. So, what do you think? You talked a little bit about how your faith shifted as you grew into adulthood. So, what do you think feels the most destabilizing for women when their beliefs start to shift?
Yeah, so this is what we call cognitive dissonance, is when we have a belief and we're seeing things that don't line up with those beliefs. There's a gap between what we believe and what we're seeing and experiencing, and that's called cognitive dissonance. And the reality is when you start to realize everything that you have shaped your identity on is false or inaccurate or human and not
Yeah.
perfect, your identity is going to feel very destabilized,
Mhm.
right? You're going to feel very destabilized. And I think in many ways, I say sometimes God is the one doing that shaking, because when we put our hope and our identity on anything outside of Him, it's like what does He say? The wise man builds his house upon the rock.
Yep.
And it's sure and foundation, and the foolish man builds his house upon the sand, and great is the fall of that. So whenever we're building identity on something that isn't Him, it's going to feel devastating. It's going to be earth shaking. It's going to be very destabilizing, and it's going to be very decentralizing. Your nervous system is going to be freaking out because it's like everything I've learned that is safe is not actually safe. So you have to retrain your nervous system at the core to relearn safety.